who were all at the University of Washington, which is where this adventure on mimesis started in the first place. And it wouldn't have started without the wise advice of Mikkel Borch-Jacobsen and Henry Staten, who, full disclosure, they were my supervisors. So, and the last time that I saw Henry, I think it was at the defense of my PhD. So it has been quite a while, over 13 years. And for me, this conference is a way to pay tribute to the influences in my thinking, in my work, in the craft of reading, to use a term that Henry likes, the techne of reading, which I think was the engine that allowed me to get this $1 million euro grant. It is a craft that does the work across disciplines. So without further ado, let me introduce our first keynote speaker, Mikkel Borch-Jacobsen. And as I just said, one of the key principles of Homo Mimeticus is to acknowledge genealogical sources of inspiration and inviting some of these sources to contribute to the mimetic turn is a way to pay tribute to these influences. Mikkel Borch-Jacobsen is the first keynote speaker because, if I may say, he's the last in a chain of influential philosophers who started the return to a different conception of the mimetic subject in the first place. The name in this chain are no other than Jacques Derrida, Jean-Luc Nancy, and Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe. All of three, if I'm not mistaken, were part of Mikkel's dissertation committee as he graduated from the University of Strasbourg in the early 80s. I started my graduate studies 20 years later, leaving from Lausanne to Seattle. But it is this École de Strasbourg that I found on the other side of the Atlantic that contributed most to my mimetic education and eventually led to Homo Mimeticus. Mikkel Borch-Jacobsen is in fact Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature and French at the University of Washington in Seattle, and the author of numerous influential books on psychoanalysis, mental illness, and psychic artifacts. He wrote landmark philosophical studies of Freud and Lacan from the perspective of a psychic mimesis, or a form of hypnotic rapport, which psychoanalysis tends to disavow, yet Borch-Jacobsen shows is constitutive of its birth and continues to haunt under the mask of transfer or identification, for instance, the psychoanalytical project. His books, most explicitly devoted to defending the thesis of a mimetic subject in which the other is constitutive of the self, include The Freudian Subject, 1988 in English translation, Lacan, The Absolute Master, 1990, and The Emotional Tie, subtitled Psychoanalysis, Mimesis, and Politics, all published with Stanford University Press. In his more recent books, he turned chameleon-like into a philosophical historian who developed constructivist historical analysis of the co-production of psychical facts and theories, including, and this is published with Sonu Shamdasani, The Freud Files, published with Cambridge University Press in 2011, Making Minds and Madness, From Hysteria to Depression, published in 2009, and more recently, Freud's Patients, A Book of Lives, published in 2021 in English translation, which narrates for the first time the Freudian legend from the perspective of the patients themselves. That is a perspective that has not been heard before. So there you have originality. His titles today sums up the genealogical spirit of the conference that looks back genealogically to the foundations of mimetic theory from the perspective of the present, as it reads, Plato on Facebook. Mikkel, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Nilesh. And indeed, we must think the present. This is what Hannah Arendt admonished in Between Past and Present. We must think the present because thought is born of the event, of what happens to us here and now. Hannah Arendt's present was, of course, totalitarianism, which she defined as a totally new political regime, different as much from the various forms of tyranny as from democracy. No regime until then had completely abolished the differences around which the polis is organized and articulated. Parliamentary democracy in particular rests on the explicit recognition of the division of society, horizontal division between parties, classes, and opinions, vertical division between the people, demos, and its representatives. In contrast, totalitarianism, whether Nazi or Stalinist, was characterized, according to Arendt, by a unification and a homogenization of society through the imposition of an ideology, by which she meant the logical coherence of an idea, of an grand omni-explicative narrative that was made real, literally, through terror. Anything that contradicted the cohesion of the Germanic Volksgemeinschaft or the classless society was physically eliminated, whether it be inferior races or moribund classes. It did not matter whether this ideological narrative corresponded to reality or not, since reality itself could be shaped in the image of the narrative, with death or re-education camps, autos da fe, or cultural revolution. Minds, likewise, were formed and informed by a centralized and omnipresent propaganda that disseminated that narrative to the masses using all the means of mass communication available at the time: press, radio, cinema, not to mention art and literature. Our present is no longer that one, even if truly totalitarian regimes have appeared since the time of Hannah Arendt, such as Maoist China, the Khmer Rouge, or the Islamic State. What we are witnessing today is rather the rise of populisms. They too are characterized by a will to abolish the division of society in favor of a people that is one, united, unanimous, except that this will, unlike what happened in totalitarian regimes, arises from within democracy itself. Populism is often seen as a threat to democracy, but we forget that it is its staunch defender. Populism, whether of the right or the left, does not want less, but more democracy, and a more direct one, more referendum-based, more representative of the demos. Stop the steal, take back control. Populism wants to get rid of all the mediations that separate the people from itself. Political or trade union representatives, governmental institutions, media outlets, experts, lobbies, bureaucrats, all accused of deciding in place of the people, without the people, and behind its back. Drain the swamp. Hence the propensity of populist movements to give credence to the most outlandish conspiracy theories, insofar as any official discourse or narrative necessarily becomes suspect since it is distant and therefore opaque, non-transparent. The criterion of truth is no longer the consensus of experts on a matter of fact, but the proximity of the people to itself. It's true because my neighbor or my cousin told me so. And I believe it precisely because the elites say the opposite and see it as a baseless fiction. In a dizzying reversal, the rumor becomes truer than the best established fact because that fact has been established by witnesses who we cannot trust. Welcome to the world of alternative facts and post-truth. We can see the difference with totalitarianism and its regime of truth. Whether totalitarian propaganda formed unanimous masses by imposing on them one top-down narrative that was supposed to be truer than reality, populisms achieved the same result by the proliferation of narratives and rumors that spread from one person to another in a rhizomatic and horizontal way. And if they achieve this so easily, it's because proximity has taken on a whole new meaning with these new forms of mass communication that are electronic social networks, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, Telegram, etc., etc. In the past, rumors were limited to small word-of-mouth social networks, such as congregations, neighborhoods, or professional circles. Today, they are shared virally by millions of people who are all friends or followers of each other, all united in a single rejection of the lies that are the official truth. That these rumors are sometimes launched or retweeted by the head of state himself does not change anything insofar as he presents himself as the first and closest friend of his millions of followers, and denounces the actions of the deep state and the cabal of pedophiles, of which he is both the victim and the slayer. The populist demagogue, unlike the charismatic leader of totalitarian regimes, is a deconstructor of state and truth, a clown who ridicules his office to be closer to us, his base. He is like us, and we are like him, we, the people. So this is what we need to think, this electronic sociality and this politics of post-truth, which seem to us to destroy at its base the social and epistemic contract on which democratic life is based. How is this reversal of truth into falsehood and falsehood into truth even possible? How can enlightened and law-abiding citizens be transformed overnight into an irrational, emotional, violent, insurrectional mob? Obviously, it's not on the side of modern philosophies of the social contract that one should look for an answer, since it is precisely the contract, this contract, that populisms shatter. I therefore propose to go back to the past, as Hannah Arendt always did, and more particularly to Plato, the father of political philosophy, to find the means to understand our present. Plato's great text on social networks is the Ion. Ion, in the dialogue that bears his name, is a rhapsode, that is to say, a professional reciter of Homeric poetry. The rhapsodes, dressed in sumptuous red costumes, would declaim, or to put it better, perform passages from Homer, Hesiod, or Archilochus in the rhapsodic contests held during the religious festivities of Greek cities, such as the Athenian Pan-Athenaic Games. It is important to realize that these festivals, like the great Dionysius, during which tragic contests were held in Athens, were civic events which gathered all the residents, male and female, except for the slaves. Plato in the Ion speaks of an audience of 20,000 people. The citizens communed there in the ritual recall of the great stories, the mythoi, in which the poets, in particular Homer, the father of Greece, told the divine and human origins of Hellas. So rhapsody and the tragic theater were quite literally the means of mass communication of the time. So one day, Socrates meets Ion in the street. Ion has just returned from the festival of Epidaurus, where he has won the first prize by reciting Homer, because Ion is specialized in the interpretation, hermeneia, of Homer, a bit like Laurence Olivier was specialized in the interpretation of Shakespeare, or Glenn Gould in that of Bach. Socrates admits to Ion that he envies his profession, his technique, which allows him to wear such beautiful clothes, and especially to be the, quote, interpreter of the poet's thought to those who listen, end of quote, which is, quote again, impossible unless one knows just what the poet is saying, oti lege, end of quote. Techne, which is translated here as profession and elsewhere as craft, art, or skill, means more precisely the know-how of a specialist, the knowledge that allows someone to do or make something, and only one thing. Socrates insists on this very point, both in the Ion and in the Republic. I quote him, "The deity has assigned to each separate profession, ton technon, the power of knowing a particular occupation," end of quote. So that the pilot doesn't have the same technique as the doctor doesn't have the same technique as the carpenter, etc., etc. So how come, Socrates asks, that Ion can only interpret what Homer says, his logos, and not what other poets say? Archilochus and Hesiod also talk about divination or war, just like Homer. But Ion only knows how to talk about it as Homer talks about it, by adopting his lexis, his way of saying. Ion is obliged to admit he poetizes and rhapsodizes well only when it's Homer who is in play. So his art is not, quote, the technique of poetry taken as a whole, end of quote. And it is not, Socrates explains to him at some length, a technique at all. I quote at some length here. This gift, so I quote Socrates, this gift you have of speaking well on Homer is not a technique. It is a divine force, theia dynamis, impelling you like the power in the stone Euripides called the magnet. This stone does not simply attract the iron rings just by themselves. It also imparts to the rings a force enabling them to do the same thing as the stone itself, that is, to attract another ring, so that sometimes a chain is formed, quite a long one, of iron rings suspending from one another. For all of them, however, their force depends on that lodestone. Just so the muse. She first makes men inspired, entheus, and then through the inspired ones, others share in the enthusiasm, enthusiasmos, and a chain is formed for the epic poets. All the good ones have their excellences not from techne, but are inspired, possessed, katechomenoi. So it is also with the good lyric poets. As the worshipping Corybantes are not in their senses when they dance, so the lyric poets are not in their senses when they make these lovely poems. They are seized with the Bacchic transport and are possessed. End of quote. The poets, Socrates continues, are only, I quote, interpreters, hermenes of the gods, each one possessed by the divinity to whom he is in bondage, end of quote. And the rhapsodes, in their turn, are, quote, interpreters of interpreters, each one held by the poet by whom they are possessed, before transmitting their enthusiasm to their public. Hermeneia, interpretation, also means quite literally transmission. I quote again, well, do you see, Ion, that the spectator is the last of the rings I spoke of, which receives their force from one another by virtue of the lodestone? You, the rhapsode and actor, Hippocrates, are the middle ring. And the first one is the poet himself, end of quote. So here is a chain, a social network through which a divine force is transmitted from one person to the other, attaching them to each other. Now, what is thus transmitted is not a content, a message, a divine logos. It is a very particular state that allows the transmission, the magnetic contagion. Plato calls it enthusiasm, enthusiasmos. In other words, quite literally, the trance of possession, katokoke. The poet, then the rhapsode and actor, then the public are all in tears, that is to say, literally, engodded. They become the god, theos, each one in its turn. The reference to the Corybantes and the backhands will help us understand what Plato is talking about. The Corybantes, whose name comes from korubas, possessed, celebrated rites, teletai, intended to relieve people suffering from what Plato calls in Phaedrus the ritual madness, telestike mania. Phrygian melodies attributed to the Cylenes Marsyas and Olympus, two demons of the Dionysian pantheon, were played on the aulos, the flute, at which point the patients recognizes the god's signal, would go into a trance and perform a furious dance during which they imitated the behavior of the particular daimon they were possessed of. In Laws, Plato specifies that these Bacchic dances consisted in a mimic imitation of nymphs, paeans, Silenae, and satyrs, and were performed as a part of certain rituals and initiations, end of quote. So the Corybantic ritual, to which Plato compares the enthusiasm of poets, rhapsodes, actors, and their audiences, consisted in a spectacular mimesis during which the patients were initiated into the divine force that agitated them, and thus found a cathartic deliverance and purification. Catharsis is the term used by Aristotle in an identical context in Book 8 of Politics. So the magnetic chain or network of the iron is a mimetic chain or network, where each one joins in turn in the dance to become an other, the same as another. What Plato describes here is exactly what others at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries would call variously psychic contagion, collective hysteria, or crowd psychology, all phenomena characterized by a subjective malleability and a contamination, imitative, said Todd, identificatory, said Freud, between individuals. In fact, the enthusiasm that is communicated from one to another is not something that would be communicated. It is communication itself, the receptivity to the other. Mimetic enthusiasm is communicative. When iron interprets, that is to say, transmits Homo, it is not so much Homo who possesses him. It is a state of enthusiasm which had allowed Homo to be possessed, inspired by his characters, and which now allows him too, iron, to play the roles of Andromache, Hecuba, or Priam by experiencing all their emotions before having them be experienced in turn by his listeners. I quote Iron, "Whenever I recite a tale of pity, my eyes are filled with tears. And when it is one of horror or dismay, my hair stands up and my hair stands up on end with fear, and my heart goes leaping. End of quote. In Iron, Plato is content to describe this contagious force of poetic mimesis, even qualifying it as divine. In the Republic, on the other hand, he strongly condemns it. This is even, Socrates tells Glaucon at the very beginning of book 10, the reason why mimetic poetry had to be banned from the city. I quote, "Why, between ourselves, for you will not betray me to the tragic poets and all other mimeticians, Mimeticus, that kind of poetry seems to be a corruption, lobe, of the minds of all the listeners who do not have as an antidote, pharmacon, the knowledge of its real nature." End of quote. Socrates comes back to this a bit later. I quote again, "But we have not yet brought our chief accusation against poetry, its power to corrupt, lambastai, with rare exceptions, even the better sort, is surely the chief cause for alarm. When we hear Homo or some other of the makers of tragedy imitating one of the heroes who is in grief and is delivering a long tirade in his lamentations or chanting and beating his breast, you know that even the very best of us feel pleasure and abandon ourselves. We follow him in genuine sympathy, and we praise as an excellent poet the one who, so to speak, puts us in the same state as his hero." End of quote. Notice that the sympatheia, this feeling with or compassion, takes place when we listen to, quote, Homer or some other of the makers of tragedy imitating one of the heroes who is in grief, etc. Not only does Plato quite simply identify the epic poet and the tragic poet, but he stages them literally as rhapsodes or tragic actors playing roles in front of us, the listeners. Besides, Plato had used earlier, a little earlier, the verb rhapsodize, rhapsoding, to describe Homer and Hesiod reciting their verses. The reason for this crushing of all differences between poets and performers is, of course, that for him, they are all interpreters, hermeneis, that is to say, enthused and enthusing, magnetized and magnetizing, inspired and inspiring mimeticians. Socrates then warns against this sympathetic contagion that makes the passionate part of the soul, of psyche, escape from the control of its rational part, thus upsetting the hierarchical division of the soul, which echoes the hierarchical division of the city into distinct professions, technai. I quote, "That part which is by nature best in us relaxes its guard over this planing part under the pretext that it is the spectator of another man's sufferings. And there is no disgrace in praising and pitying someone else who abandons himself to excessive grief. Few people, I think, are capable of reasoning that the enjoyment we derive from other people's experiences inevitably affect our own. For it's not easy to restrain pity in our own sufferings when we have nurtured it and made it strong in those of others. And poetic mimesis has the same effect on us with regard to sex and anger and all the other appetites and pains and pleasures of the soul, for it nourishes and waters them when they ought to be dried up." End of quote. So poetic mimesis is an accelerator of passions, just like the modern algorithms of Facebook or Twitter. It impassions us, it affects us, it infects us, and as such, it exercises a real power over us. We should not believe, therefore, Plato tells us, that it is a mere simulacrum, a copy without reality that we could watch unharmed. And yet, this is exactly what he had just stated a little earlier when defining mimesis not as, I quote, the imitation of reality as it is, but the imitation of an appearance, phenomenon, or of a simulacrum, phantasma, end of quote. The passage is well known, and some of you already referred to it today. Firstly, the God produces the idea or form, idea, eidos, of the bed, which is unique and solely real. Secondly, the bed maker, demiurgos klines, quote, doesn't make the real couch, but something that resembles the real being, end of quote. Thirdly comes the painter, who produces the appearance, the phenomenon of the made bed, that is to say, a mere imitation, a mimesis of the bed. The painter, like, quote, the maker of tragedies, is in his nature 3 removes from the king and truth, as are all other imitators, Mimeticus, end of quote. Thus, the model, the copy, and the copy of the copy. Or as Gilles Deleuze put it in a very essay on Plato and simulacrum, the same, the similar, and the simulacrum. It is at this ontological hierarchy that commentators usually stop, even when they want to overturn it in a Nietzschean or Baudrillardian way. The mimetic simulacrum would have less being, it is said, than the idea and its exact copy. But why then would this pale phantom be so dangerous, so politically dangerous, that Socrates sees in the banishment of mimetic poets the essential achievement of his plan for the polis? In fact, the passage on the 3 beds is not so much about the being of imitations, good or bad, as about the being, or better said, the identity of the imitator, of the mimetician. Either the craftsman, the demiurgos, always imitates the same model in order to always make or do the same thing, in which case he has a technique of his own that defines, identifies him as a bed maker, a pilot, or a doctor. Or he is like the fantastic demiurgos Socrates imagines, who can create anything by holding up a mirror to the world, in which case he is a mimetician, that is to say, a polytechnician who has no technique of his own. The painter, I quote Socrates, the painter will paint as a cobbler, a carpenter, and other craftsmen, demiurgos, though he himself has no knowledge of any of these professions, ton techno, end of quote. Likewise for the makers of tragedy and their father, Homo, of whom, I quote, some people tell us that these poets know all kinds of crafts, all kinds of technos, end of quote. So this is why mimeticians are so dangerous. They imitate everyone, thus destabilizing the strict division of roles and identities on which Socrates in Book 2 had found the just city. One man, one technique. Worse still, the mimeticians invite us to imitate their mimicry, to enter the dance of enthusiasm, and to become, in our turn, a ring in the mimetic chain or network. As Socrates said, mimetic poetry corrupts, quote, the minds of all the listeners who do not have as an antidote, pharmacon, the knowledge of its real nature, end of quote. Now, this antidote is, of course, none other than the theory of ideas, which allows here to tie each technique, and thus also each craftsman, each technicus, to the unique and invariable model to which they must conform. Platonic ontology is a politics of ideas. It's a way to stabilize the division of society and to prevent the uncontrollable proliferation of ideas, stories, and memes, mimema. But it should be noted that this ontology of ideas, had first to be created. It had to be made, poietos, and even very literally had to be fictionalized, since it is presented in Book 7 of the Republic in the form of a story, mythos, the mythos of the cave, and this within the larger narrative or myth that is the Republic itself. It should be borne in mind that Socrates in this dialogue, I quote, maps out, as Glaucon puts it, a city that is founded only in our words, logos, for I think that it cannot be found nowhere on earth, end of quote. So having, quote again, led the foundation of city by words to logo, end of quote, namely the principle according to which, I quote again, it is impossible for one man to do the work of many professions, many technos, end of quote. Socrates proposes in Book 2 to create a body of guardians to protect the city against internal as well as external violence. It will therefore be necessary to train, that is to say, to educate men having a character corresponding to this particular technique, that the technique that will be, as we will learn subsequently, the technique of the philosopher, kings and queens. I quote Socrates, "Come then, just as we were telling stories or myth, mytholunguntis, let us educate these men in our discourse, logo," end of quote. Turns out this pedagogical logos is a discourse about the pedagogical power of logos. More precisely, of the stories, mythoi, that one tells children. The Greek paideia, Greek education, was based on gymnastics for the body on the one hand, and musicae for the mind on the other hand, the latter of which consisting essentially in the recitation of the deeds of the Greek gods and heroes as narrated by the poets. Now, Socrates explains, these stories told to children may well be a fiction or a lie. Pseudos. Pseudo can mean fiction and lie. But they still form their psyche, that is, their minds and their mind and character. Or so, as psyche can also be translated. I quote Socrates, because that is a time when they are easily molded and when any impression we choose to make leaves an impermanent mark. End of quote. An impression here is typos, which is the center of Lacoue-Labarthe's commentary on book 203 of the Republic in typography. Now, this is, of course, the very principle of education, of idea, but it also its danger, because the psyche of children, and more generally of men, is mimetic. It takes model on everything it is taught, whether it be a true or a false logos, an alites or pseudos logos. The regime, the mimetic regime, is the regime of post-truth, which would be better, it would be better to call pre-truth. We become, better, we are the stories we are told, beyond truth and falsity, beyond good and evil. It is therefore necessary, from Plato's point of view, to control the logos of poets and storytellers in order to propose to the future guardians only models that will form their mind and character in the desired direction. And so this is the age-old logic of censorship, which we still find today in discussions around media and social networks. Note that Socrates, at this point, defends himself from forging myth here, even though this is obviously what he's doing. I quote, "Adeimantus, you and I are not poets, but founders of a city. And founders need to know the models or patterns, typos, on which poets are to compose their stories, but they don't need to compose the stories themselves," end of quote. So Socrates consequently enjoins poets to depict virtuous, honest, temperate, courageous gods and heroes, etc., so that the future guardians model themselves on them. In particular, poets should not represent a god who changes form, like Proteus, because the guardians must follow only one role model, a model who, I quote Socrates, remains in his own form without variation forever, end of quote, lest they follow a mimetician fit for all kinds of roles and techni. Because indeed, this would pose a grave threat to the stability of the social differences on which Socrates founded the city, which is why Socrates goes on to censor not only the poets' logos, what they say, but also their lexis, their way of saying. For the storyteller must not set the bad example of someone who speaks, quote, as if he were someone else, end of quote. And so this is the well-known distinction, to whom many have allowed before today, between pure narration, haply diegesis, where the poet uses indirect speech without confusing himself with the one he's talking about, and mimetic narration, mimesis, where he uses direct speech, imitating, therefore, the characters he's having speak. In our city, Socrates declares, I quote, "There is no twofold or manifold man among us, since every man does one thing," end of quote. We must therefore banish all the mimetic storytellers, epic poets and rhapsodes, tragic poets and actors, and retain only the more austere storyteller who proposes distinct and invariable role models while remaining himself invariable. Because only in this way will it be possible to form guardians who will remain in their turn invariable each one in his place before they become philosophers by turning their gaze toward the immutable ideas of the beautiful, the just, and the good, this conversion of the soul being the ultimate goal of idea. So this, in a nutshell, is what Plato says in his story about the education of the Guardian's philosophers. But how does he say it? He says it in a story where he speaks through a general narrator, Socrates, who himself oscillates between narrative passages and mimetic ones, in which he speaks under the name of Glaucon, Adeimantus, Thrasymachus, and others. So Plato does, as has often been pointed out, the very thing he reproaches the poets and rhapsodes for doing. And this is all the more true since Plato, as Pierre Hadot reminds us, used to read his dialogues aloud in public readings, which were in this essentially oral culture, the most efficient way to spread one's ideas. Plato must therefore have been interpreting, miming Socrates and the other characters, just like any old rhapsode or actor. The reason for this, Pierre Hadot explains, is that Plato viewed his dialogues as a means to change people. They were not written, Hadot says, to inform his listeners, but to form them, to transform them. I quote Hadot, "The dialogues can be considered as propaganda works intended to convert to philosophy," end of quote. And their aim was therefore eminently political. We see that what Plato tells in the story, that is the Republic, is exactly what he does with us, his captive and captivated audience. He educates and trains us by telling us the myth of a city where everyone stays in place, keeping to oneself and minding his own technique, without being carried away in the mimetic chain of storytellers and rumor mongers. But he does this by using mimesis against mimesis. He uses the power of myth against myth, philosophical enthusiasm against the enthusiasm of crowds and social networks. In the end, the antidote, pharmacon against the poison of mimesis is this very poison, this very pharmacon, and it's called philosophy. Thank you.